Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. So we're on week 7 now of this series. We've done 2 new town parks and 4 commercial landscapes, and I think we're already getting a feel of 20th century landscape designs. So we've had 1 restored landscape, 1 teetering on the edge of having a meaningful future, another whose wider landscape is at risk, where the future of the building is less certain. A mixture of greenfield sites and some on contaminated land, and some accompanying quite striking architecture. And we've been very fortunate inviting a range of fascinating speakers to focus in detail on each one of these post-war designed landscapes and gardens added to the Historic England's list last year. Our objectives with these talks is to raise awareness about the work and the ideas and thinking of the original designers, and also how these sites are now looking, and to see what we can learn from this and take forward, and to find out about where the relevant archives are and what makes these places still so very special. We also wanted to know about these places from an alternative perspective. So for most of the talks, we have 2 speakers, and each time it's different. So this evening, we're delighted to welcome Neave Davidson to talk to us about Alexandra Road Park in Camden. And as before, but a bit differently this time, he will be speaking with Elizabeth Knowles, who's chair of the Alexandra Road Park Friends, and also a resident here, who over the past 40 years has watched the rise and fall of this park and actively not just campaigned with 2 other women, but formed a park restoration group and applied for lottery funding. And it's very pleasing to say also that she's metamorphosed from being a midwife and a nurse into a trained gardener with her own gardening business. So we're going to start with Neil. So he's a landscape architect, partner of J&L Gibbons, founding director of the social enterprise Landscape Learn. He's a built environment expert panel member at the Design Council, a member of ICOMOS International Scientific Committee, chair of the trustees of the Bethnal Green Nature Reserve, and also trustee of Phytology, an art and ecology project based at the Bethnal Green Nature Reserve. He's a lecturer on the MA in Landscape Architecture course at the Bartlett, and is going to be teaching students in Rome, or Zooming Rome this week. So Neil, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. It's a pleasure to be here, everyone. I just wanted to start with this rather wordy slide, because it's very important on a project like this to talk about collaboration. And it really wouldn't have been possible without the input of a great many people. And that extends from the professional team to the excellent project managers on this project around the block, but also Sarah Cooch, the landscape historian, who were both involved prior to our engagement. Oops. So to start with, I wanted to do a bit of scene setting for those of you who are not aware of where Alexandra Road Park is located. Hopefully you can see my cursor hovering around in the center of the screen. This is Alexandra Road Park, which is part of the Alexandra Road and Ainsworth Estate in Camden. You'll notice there's a couple of railway stations, Kilburn High Road and South Hampstead, to locate it, but also it's about half a kilometre to a kilometre away from Regent's Park. And the estate itself is incredibly fascinating. But we're going to focus today primarily on the park itself, because that's the bit that we're involved in, but also is the part of the site that recently received the same listing status as the rest of the built buildings and structures in the estate, which is amazing. So taking you back a bit, the architect Neave Brown was the master planner and lead architect on this site. He started work in 1968 on the project. And I think what's quite interesting is that he always talked about this as a piece of city rather than distinct pieces of architecture and landscape. And that really is brought through in terms of the mixed uses that he designed into this piece of city. from community centres to schools, to social clubs, to a pub, and many other uses. So it really became a really thriving new addition to this part of Camden. Slightly pixelated picture, but this is an early, very early photograph of what Alexandra Road would have looked like prior to the demolition of the housing and before the estate was redeveloped. So very, very interestingly, I think, is that throughout the development of the site, there were a number of trees that were retained. And it's interesting to think that they may have been part of a front garden or back garden from one of these pre-existing houses. Many of you will know the iconic view of the Alexandra and Ainsworth estate, which is of Rowley Way. And I think it was really, really poignant that Neave described this really as building as landscape, a building with hanging gardens and its own park. And the features that you would find in a landscape, from topography to changes in level, were all part of the conceptual thinking about the buildings themselves. And this aerial view gives you a kind of idea of what the park was like prior to our involvement. And I think it's really important to sort of show what that starts to translate as in terms of a model. Alexandra Road Park is a fascinating site in that it was an entirely constructed topography. And this topography is really part of its character in terms of the mystery and sense of exploration and the ability to find sort of hidden spaces. And I think really this is kind of something that we as designers could only really understand by making a topographic model ourselves. It's quite a challenging landscape to understand, and that, I guess, was one of the biggest issues that we had as designers, was trying to think about how we could make the place more legible, and also to encourage new visitors into the site. Just a few images of this kind of topography of built form and landscape, which I think are just stunning. I should say that this is one of the few projects that we commissioned a professional photographer to take a series of photographs before any work happened. Because I just think it was important to record where we were at before we made any transformation. One key document that I need to reference as I go through the talk here is the Conservation and Management Plan, which is available to download, I believe, from the Friends website. It's a fascinating piece of work undertaken by Sarah Cooch, and really important in setting the significance of this entire place. What was also important, as I mentioned before, was the project management, and that was, around the block, which is Sue Morgan, now Chief Executive of the Landscape Institute, but also Nick Burton, who prepared the management plans. And then the three individuals that were mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, who's with me tonight, but also Eleanor Fawcett and Sarah Bell, who were the residents who made this project happen, as is often required on projects like this. It's the determination of the individual which is transformative. But this project was also really quite unusual, particularly, well, from our personal perspective, because we were able to engage with Janet Jack, the original designer of the landscape. This was a unique opportunity. Here's Janet sitting in her planting room at home. And this really, we started out on this journey through a series of discussions and really understanding from Janet herself why certain design decisions had been made, why certain things weren't realized that maybe she'd wanted to, or indeed how things had changed over the years and her outlook had shifted slightly. So she was very open to the idea of change that would make the place better, to enhance it. But also, really, we had to find a position in terms of relationship where Janet would trust us as designers not to undo all of her hard work. This drawing is particularly important. This is a drawing that Neave Brown prepared in 1969. So this starts to set out the kind of conceptual layout of the park itself. And it wasn't until 7 years later, when Janet was appointed, that she had to effectively make this wonderful topographic landscape work, and to turn it into a place that the 1,600 new residents of the estate could enjoy. This drawing is one of Janet's original drawings. In terms of where they're stored, actually, these are there's an archive of these drawings in the Garden Museum in London. And really, through this project process, we worked with Janet to encourage her that would be making sure that these drawings were preserved in somewhere that could be accessed and reviewed was really, really important. And I think that was part of this process of building some trust. What you'll see in this drawing is that there were certain fixes that Janet had to work with. The form of the park was fixed, the levels were fixed, and also there was a specific requirement for 5 playgrounds that Camden had insisted upon. They also insisted that those 5 playgrounds were for different age groups, which I think even at the time of the design of this, that probably was against the trend for making playgrounds more inclusive. But this is something that we've since worked with in terms of the designs. And these are the sections which I think really start to bring to life the changes that you see across the topography, from built form to the park itself, and the made ground that created the sense of enclosure and the spatial character. I think there's a very interesting quote that Catherine Croft, at the time when she was director of the 20th century, said that this was the most significant landscape of its type in the UK. And I think there is many reasons why that is borne out in terms of the design. I think there was obviously a groundswell of interest in Scandinavian and particularly Danish landscape design at this particular moment in time. And Janet always described her love of Danish design, particularly the work of Sorensen. And it's quite interesting to note that Janet was taught by Preben Jakobsen, another Danish landscape architect, while she was at the Thames Polytechnic, which is now Greenwich University. Like many of these projects, we started to describe the park as a series of character areas. This is not least important in terms of how we start to build up a budget for park rejuvenation, but it was also a way, it started to explain the way that Janet had designed these spaces to be distinct enclosures or open or places of openness, which allowed quiet contemplation and places to relax in, but also all of these playable spaces, whether it was playable formal play with equipment, or whether it was a multi-use games court, or indeed just really the whole park as a playable experience. We're really lucky with the photographic records on this project. These are a combination of images from Janet, but also from Elizabeth and I think some others. This is a photograph from 1979 of the park, so really just as it was being completed. Actually, it might be 1980, so it was 79-80 was the dates where it was completed. And this is looking from the Tenants Hall west across the whole length of the park. The park itself is about 1.7 hectares, but it's very linear, and that throws up some interesting challenges in terms of the legibility of the place as somebody visiting it. And I think what you can see in this image is some of those telltale Danish influences. So the use of hedgerows to accentuate the topography and the spaces. Diagonal paths across the park, again, a very popular design tool in Danish design. And then also this idea of sheltered play. So you can start to see some of the sheltered play spaces in the foreground of this image. This is another image of that time. So this is a part of the site known as the Mound. And I think what's really fascinating about these images is they are a photographic study in tree growth and sort of the vigor of tree planting in urban locations over a 40-year period. If you go to site today, you'll see many of these trees. They'll be considerably larger. This is an area looking at the area known as the Meadow. And I think these larger trees must have been some of those street trees that I was mentioning before, but you can see all of the new tree planting in the foreground. And again, there's an interesting comment that Janet made, which was she'd always anticipated some tree thinning to be part of this project. She'd always understood that maintenance would be proactive. So, but what actually happened is a lot of the trees just grew with such vigor and there was no tree thinning. So it created a very unusual character. Not quite what Janet had envisaged, but nevertheless quite important in terms of revisiting the project in 2014. And then this is a great photograph. I believe that's your son in the foreground.
No, it's not. No, it's before that. This is by Bill Jack.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's lovely, isn't it?
So this is kind of just the whole place is a playable landscape, whilst we have these formal spaces. And I think on the right-hand side of this image, you can see a group of 19 lime trees. This is the perfect example of an area where those lime trees were all allowed to grow to maturity. That was never the intention. So we ended up with some very spindly, unusual forms. And so we had to very carefully work out a strategy to thin that out so the remaining trees would thrive in that environment. This is known as Playground 5. So this is really quite embedded in the center of the site. You can start to see some of the bespoke elements that Janet had designed, but also sitting alongside some more off-the-shelf equipment. And I think it's really important to set this in context of the time. This is really only a few years after Lady Allen of Hartwood's Planning for Play was released, and I think there is you can start to see in here the influences of this idea of natural play, and maybe not in the sense of in these images as the planting is so new, but really this was a park where planting was at the forefront of all of Janet's designs and was incredibly important part of the structure of the site. And we were lucky enough to be able to refer to Janet's drawings, a kind of interesting combination of imperial and metric drawings, as that transition was still sort of ongoing, I guess. And then uses of really honest materials, lots of concrete block, lots of timber painted. So there started to become this, as we were talking to Janet, this quite strong graphic identity to the park. You see a lot of this stained black timber around the sites, whether it's in handrails or whether it's in fences. And I think what all of these details start to do, I mean, I do recall that Janet had a couple of Japanese architects working with her, as did Neave, and this really has a sense of sort of Japanese joinery about a lot of these details. And then these are some of the setting out drawings, again, for playgrounds, in this case, playground 5 and 4. So starting to look at slightly different age groups and the scale of these things. So these were a very important reference point for us, and in terms of our discussions with Janet, but also thinking about how we could restore the certain materials and features in the park. And then you start to see some of these features, and Janet did lament the inclusion of these off-the-shelf pieces, and that was a requirement of Camden. It was also a requirement of the dreaded value engineering process, and unfortunately, this really came from a position of Camden being risk averse in terms of play, and I think we've managed to take some of Janet's ideas in the current incarnation of these play spaces and really be a lot more challenging in terms of risk, which is so important in terms of young people and play. And then again, just a couple of things to mention, this kind of topography in concrete, but also the geodesic dome, which you'll see we took inspiration for a little later. And then this playground 1, this slide park, I think there's some interesting parallels to some of the reference projects in Planning for Play, particularly a playground in Luleå in Sweden. And again, this kind of this topography of play, which is really, really important. Some of the drawings that then went alongside that. And as I mentioned, Janet was a formidable plantswoman, and she had a really strong agenda for planting in this park. Hedges and planting for wildlife and hedgerows were a very, very prominent part of the structure of the entire park. She was very keen on fruiting and flowering species to appeal to senses and to have year-round interest. And in some places, she deliberately created spaces that were reminiscent of countryside hedgerows. There's a great phrase where she described as trying to have conjuring the sense of countryside in the middle of the city. And there were also some more formal garden plants around the site, a lot of which still survived. And really, when we started to analyze the site, the main missing species were those that are a little bit more delicate and smaller. So quite a lot of the flowering species had disappeared and had been overtaken by the more robust plants like ivy, which was predominant in the park. So if we come to the park grows. So Janet always said that she designed the park to be low maintenance and never expected it to have no maintenance. I think this was probably the turning point, as we'll talk about with Elizabeth a bit later, but the park definitely went through ups and downs in terms of its care. And I think what was really important here was to start to think about how we could reveal what was still there and then enhance with small interventions. And really the thing that struck me as on our first site visits was that the overall structure of the park was so strong, whether that was built form or with the walls that enclosed some of the spaces, or whether it was the planting or the character of planting in different areas. That was really, really quite bold and strong and really survived the lack of maintenance. But what we found in other areas is a real sense of decline, where maintenance had just allowed certain places to get out of control or certain plant species to predominate. And I think even without the maintenance that Janet had anticipated, this sense of wildness and countryside was still prevalent and really made the park such a special place, even without any intervention. This is a view from the tenants hall, and this is then a view of one of the playgrounds in 2013. And what you'll see is those sort of black rubber surfaces are where play equipment used to be, but they'd been removed because they were deemed to be unsafe for children to play in. So a lot of features had been removed from the park, which was really needed some considerable analysis to understand how we might reinstate and what we might do to bring things back. But really the large scale planting that Janet had designed was really kind of still very strong. It just needed a bit of care and a rejuvenation of a lot of the planting beds to ensure that future generations could also enjoy the park too. And as I mentioned, a lot of the good example here, hawthorn and viburnum in the background there had grown to very, very large sizes, where actually the intervisibility, the sort of views between some of these enclosed spaces had been lost. And that was really, in some places, it was important for that enclosure. In others, it was more important to think about how we could manage this landscape to allow people to see between the spaces. And I think this is this bleak photograph is kind of a good example of what had happened to those play spaces. So this is the one you saw earlier with the geodesic dome in it. And then we had quite a lot of self-seeded tree plant, Robinia in this particular playground. But really everything was looking a bit unloved and needed some serious TLC, but also thinking about it in a way that was going to ensure it was going to be robust going forward. But again, as I say, even with the lack of TLC, there's a really romantic quality to this park before we did any work to it. And then, so the last bit of my talk is going to be about the process of reinvigorating the park. The vision that we established with the park management group, local residents, Camden Council and others was really to allow the original design intent to flourish, to enhance planting and biodiversity across the site, to repair and revive certain features, think about new play offer in the park, and fundamentally to try and improve accessibility across the whole site. Now, this was done through a number of activities, whether it was a Jubilee picnic here with Punch and Judy attracting, I'm not sure Punch or Judy was doing the consultation this day, but we used these opportunities to introduce ideas about play and on what might be of interest going forward. We then had a number of workshops over a series of weeks where we looked specifically at play in the park. And then this is Susanna in the foreground from Erect Architecture, one of the directors there. We worked very closely with Susanna and her team to create these new bespoke play areas. And I think one of the interesting things that came out of these conversations was there was a recognition that 5 new distinct players was perhaps not the right approach in terms of kind of moving forward, excuse me. And there was some merit in thinking about play areas that provided spaces for, sorry, I've just got a little frog in my throat. That there was some merit in having play spaces that were specifically for different age groups, but also allowing opportunities for greater free play in the park. I really enjoyed the way that Susanna and her team developed this particular play structure, which if you can take a flight of imagination, you can imagine that this is in fact a deconstructed geodesic dome in Playground 3, but designed with a lot of thought around how repeat visits could be facilitated in this play space, and that any one experience may be quite different to the next day when a child is using this particular bit of play equipment. So we developed an approach that really was about layering, and this particularly extends to the whole approach we took to management, working very closely with Nick Burton at Around the Block. We found a strategy that would be sensitive to this site, but also included some of the fairly radical management regimes that were required to make it a much more healthy, thriving park in the future. And I suppose apart from the playgrounds that I've mentioned, so as I was mentioning, there's the playground 5 and 4 and 3 and 2 together. We came up with the scenario where we'd have 2 formal playgrounds embedded in the center of the park, one for very young children, one for 5 to 8. The more challenging structure I talked about from 8 to 12 in the center, and then actually spaces for free play. So where there was previously quite formal play provision, these became really just free play in terms of surfaces. So for wheeled sports, actually very popular with yoga enthusiasts now. And at the slide we didn't end up with trying to recreate what was there. Effectively, this became a place where a bit of hard paving became green, and it became a place to sit and watch people playing in the multi-use games court. So it became a spectator terrace. So this was a kind of discussion that we had with Janet through this, and we also talked obviously through this all with the residents, and kind of came to consensus that it was okay for this to change, but the structure, the principles were all very, very aligned with Janet's original design. And then these are a couple of I deliberately didn't put in too many of the slightly sort of degraded photographs of the park, because there are plenty I could have shown you, but really principal things that needed to be resolved. Here we have a bench back, but we have no bench. We have wobbly steps, so access was always an issue across the whole site. And then a whole range of different concrete pavers, which just needed some TLC. So we really took an approach of, which I think is a very hot topic, particularly in the weeks of COP26, about retrofitting. So wherever we could, we reused materials that were already in the park. We had an approach of lifting the paving stones, cleaning them, putting down proper sub-base, and relaying them. And really, we were actually very successful at that. We only needed to bring in some new paving stones where they were incredibly damaged. And that was really on the part of the park called Langtree Walk, where vehicles had used it for maintenance operations. A little bit about the concrete walls. We worked very carefully with Round Technologies, who had done a lot of work on the estate previous to our involvement. A lot of investigative studies into the concrete mixes, the types of aggregate, and some of the main problems that occurred here, where there was a lot of iron pyrites, which was leaking onto the wall surfaces. But the main issue really was graffiti and how to deal with that going forward. So there was all sorts of experiments done in terms of low pressure washing, high pressure washing, chemical treatments, and then also how we might start to make treatments on the walls in terms of a wash, a cementitious wash. So this is experiments with Portland cement, but also with white Portland cement, and trying to match into the wall. So we did a lot of prototyping to, with the support of Historic England, to come up with a strategy here that was something that Camden could enact going forward if there was any further graffiti. And hopefully you can make this out, but this is on a relatively recent visit, and it's knots and crosses in crayon on one of the walls, and I think that's probably one of the most acceptable forms of graffiti in the park. So I'm just going to rattle through some slides here. These are photographs after the construction project, where we had a number of places where it was really important to radically change attitudes towards the aftercare. And we were really, really fortunate on this project, largely through the support of certain people in Camden Council, but also through Sue Morgan's hard work. During this process, the park transferred from ownership of Camden's housing department to the parks department. And that meant a quite radically different approach to how the planting in particular would be maintained going forward. And that was probably one of the biggest victories actually of the whole lottery funded process. Now this is a view from just up by the Tenants and Residents Hall. And I think what's quite interesting really is that quite a lot of what we did, it would be quite difficult for somebody who didn't know what was there before to work out what actually had happened during the construction process. Because a lot of it was light touch, a lot of it was about cleaning and repair. Obviously there's moments of major transformation in the play areas, but I think what's probably the most obvious is the change to management prescriptions that were embedded in the management plan. Some of these were as simple as allowing some of the ivy to be cut back on tree trunks. Again, partly to do with the intervisibility of spaces to allow views through, but really also to allow a bit of light to the ground so some of the shrubs and ground covers could thrive. And I think these you really start to appreciate the layered landscape of the original designs when you can see that kind of depth of field. And really, it's just such a stunning, this birch bank is such a stunning space to walk through with its sloping paths. And then in Playground 5, this space for young children from 0 to 5 is really about social play and a complexity of play that Janet had designed in. So you might see some nods to those forms that were in Janet's original photographs that I showed you. But it was also about blurring the boundary between play space and planting and encouraging children to explore nature in a much more tactile and sensory way. And that's where you start to see some of the plants from Janet's original planting list that had disappeared being reintroduced. There was lots and lots of roses and lots of wild strawberry, which you'll see still thriving in the park. And then you get this sense of the enclosed spaces between the different playgrounds. Here's looking from Playground 5, the youngest one, to Playground 4, which is, again, red swings, which are referencing the red play equipment that was there before, but you can see this becomes a topography as well. So we were able to raise the topography against the listed walls, reinstate all of this timber work around here. So you've got this really strong kind of graphic space, and this is incredibly well used. The swings was the #1 request from all of our engagement sessions. So we decided to put in lots of different swings. And again, some views here. So one of the main management approaches we took was an approach to coppicing plants. So we were quite severe in some cases. We gave a lot of plants a very, very, very short haircut. But it's remarkable how quickly they recovered and how healthy those plants look now. And I think, I'm sure Elizabeth will attest, that was one of the most delicate discussions we had about how radical we would be with that. And then this is a very similar view to that one I showed you at the beginning, back towards the meadow. So you can see the existing lime trees, which were there in the photograph. You can then see the new lime trees and all of these other trees, which have really just thrived quite amazingly in a 40-year period. And then you have moments of detail, moments of softer planting, lots of hawthorn, again, which was a plant that appears throughout the site because of its connotations of countryside landscapes. The countryside or woodland walk, which again was an area where we were very acutely aware that major change here would change the character in terms of management. So we deliberately only did a 10% radical haircut, if for want of a better expression, and then we selectively thinned some areas and cut back. And again, visiting the park this year, it's really astonishing how quickly those areas have come back, and we're probably ready for the next bits of phased management of the woodland walk. And then here are some of the views in terms of the intervisibility of spaces I was talking about. So this is from the mound looking down to the meadow. And what we did in some cases is we recognized that some of these slopes and bits of topography were actually ideal play spaces. And something that Janet had kind of wanted is really for, whilst there's this formal enclosure around a lot of the planting, was for children to explore. So we made it slightly more accessible in some cases. We put in some informal steps. We didn't really make a big deal about it, but there was opportunities for kids to kind of clamber and scramble between different play spaces. I say kids, probably quite a lot of adults do it too. And then there's really these sorts of spaces became social spaces again. I think when I was most recently at the park, there was a dance troupe doing some exercises in this space. So the amount of use that these spaces get are quite phenomenal. And it's interesting how they're used by different types of users too. It's really a rich diversity of people who enjoy the park. You can see again some of these features, the planting, the viburnum, the lonicera, lots of yew planting as hedges, yuccas, again were part of Janet's original planting palette. And then you have some of these wonderful trees, a real sort of mini arboretum in this park with some very, very beautiful tree specimens. And again, some of these amazing wall structures, again, which were really just very light touch. Here in this image, for example, we reinstated post and rail, we refurbished timber, we repaired the walls, we relayed the paving. So actually, it's very sensitive intervention. There's not much going on here at all. And then by contrast, you then have this new play structure, which is very popular. I highly recommend you all have a go if you visit the park. And just some final images of these spaces. This is kind of, again, the multi-layered approach within the foreground of the background. The image on the left is some of the pre-existing plane trees that were there. The image on the right is playground 2. So the one that I was talking about is being free play. So it's really just line markings to allow all sorts of different activities that are not necessarily formal sports. The multi-use games court is where those sorts of things can happen. The amphitheatre, which is home to a small stage for performances. And here we did quite a severe haircut again on the yew to really reinvigorate the growth of that yew hedge to make it a proper enclosure, referencing a lot of those Danish examples that Janet so enjoyed, and that's really looking fabulous now. It's a shame that the horse chestnuts are struggling. And then finally, the image of playground 1, which was that slide park. So this, again, as I was saying, was really about depaving and creating spaces for social interaction, but it was also a place for future activities to happen. So since our involvement, there's been a meadow that has been is ongoing, I suppose, and So there's areas within the park where there's future activities can take place. So before Elizabeth and I have a little chat, I just wanted to finish on this kind of statement really. And this was kind of inspired by something that Drew Benelick from the lottery had said at the time of this project, which was this was probably one of the most recent pieces of heritage that the National Lottery had funded at that time. And I think that's quite an interesting thing to think about as a designer, because we tend to try and think about all of our new projects, whether they'll be worthy of being considered as future heritage. And I think that's quite an interesting mindset to put yourself into when you're starting to think about your design process and what you're actually achieving. And I think in the context of future, that has to be very much about climate change, the biodiversity and planetary emergencies that we're facing today. So Elizabeth and I are going to have a conversation about life at Alexandra Road Park, really. We've got a couple of images that we'll show you just to spark that conversation, and then we'll probably just take down the slideshow and you can see us having a chat. I mean, Elizabeth, you've lived in Alexandra and Ainsworth Estate since the very early days. You've brought up children there. You are a fundamentally important part of the community, I would say. I just wondered what, in terms of how things have changed or those early memories, is there something you'd like to talk about?
People always ask how much has changed, you know, but in lots of ways it's only changed as London has changed. And the kids play in the park. Of course, in the 70s, they had, I guess, well, they have a lot of freedom now, you know, compared with most places. You know, they only have to run out of their gate round the corner and they're in the park, so they play a lot. So, you know, in lots of ways it hasn't changed, but of course in the 70s, that was, I suppose, the last time they had freedom without phones and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think we've got this wonderful picture of Janet. So
yeah, that's Janet in her planting room, and I took that photo because I became a good friend of hers, and we shared obviously a passion about plants and planting and everything else. And I do remember when I first met her, and that was you know, you just showed one of the pictures, you know, the baby's park, and it had those kind of angled concrete places.
Yeah.
Well, they were Janet's hidey holes, she used to call them.
Yeah.
And when I moved in, okay, after about a year, I think Janet came to talk to the residents, and we were in the hall, and Janet it was terrible because the mothers, as Janet used to call them, she used to refer to how are the mothers, they complained about these hidey holes, saying that they were dangerous to the children and everything. And poor Janet, there she was. We had this wonderful park and everyone was complaining. And I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. So on the way out, I stood up and I said, look, you know, what are you on about? You know, we've got this fantastic park, you know, just say thank you.
Yeah.
At least, you know. Yeah. And then anyway, so they had to think about that. But anyway, the hidey holes did get changed. They made a kind of concrete snake that was coloured in various colours, and Janet often referred to it. She absolutely hated it. You know, but on the way out of that meeting, she passed me, and you know, because Janet was quite regal until you got to know her, and she always had a twinkle in her eye then, but she was quite regal to begin with. And she passed me and she said to me, thank you. You know. Yeah. And so we became friends.
Yeah. Well, you're a very important ally to have, Elizabeth. That's very true. And of course, you were friends with Neave Brown as well.
Yes, that's Neave. Well, that's a funny story, really, because when we were doing the park, we kind of, when I say we, Eleanor, Sarah, and I, we thought it would be very complicated, you know, if we got too many voices in there. So we decided not to actually engage with Neave all the time, you know, and then he he knew it was going on, but I phoned him once when we got the first pass funding, because of course with the HLF thing, they don't just give you a load of money and tell you to get on with it, as you know. You have to jump through the hoops. So finally we got this first pass funding, and I phoned him up and I said to him, well, you know, the park, it's going to happen. We've got first pass funding. And there was this silence. And I said to him, you sound surprised. And he said, surprised? I didn't think you had a hope in hell. You know? But
Yeah.
so that photo there was taken when the park was completed. You completed it. And he phoned me up and he said, well, I better come and have a look at my park, hadn't I? Because he said, people keep phoning me up and I haven't even seen it. In fact, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh dear, you know, I knew he'd love it.
Yeah.
You know, so that photo was taken, it was pouring with rain and we went round everywhere. That photo was taken by Sarah Bell from her house, from her flat, which overlooks the meadow. And of course he loved it. And that was fine. And then he also said to me, Elizabeth, you know what, you were right. He said, I would have interfered, you know, and I thought that was very gracious of him, you know, to say that. So
and it was, I mean, I remember meeting Neave at the opening of the rejuvenated park, and being formally introduced and being slightly nervous about what he was going to say, and he said something similar. He said, you know, I'm so pleased. It's what you've done. There's nothing that has kind of removed any of the original design intent, and also the things you have added make it better. So thank you. And that was a mighty relief, I have to say.
No, yes, he loved it.
And I think what really strikes me about the uniqueness of this project in many ways was the fact that it had a number of false starts.
It did,
but really it was the work that you did with Eleanor and Sarah and Lefkos originally as well that got things going. And I just wondered maybe some memories about that process. And
well, Eleanor is an architect, as you know, and she moved in, and Eleanor, she had a friend who'd done a Heritage Lottery Fund bid and been successful in it. I think it was a small thing, but she had it in her mind that we could go forward with this. And of course, Sarah and I had been trying to get something done about the park for ages. And we, like you say, we'd had a few false starts. And at one point, Janet had helped quite a lot. I think that was when the estate was run by a cooperative. And of course, nothing had come of it. And that's why originally, when you came along, Janet was very skeptical about things. And it took her a long time to actually realize or believe that it was going to be done. And of course, she was also getting on at that stage and not particularly well. And it took her a while, you know, to believe that it was actually going to happen. Which was understandable.
That kind of goes back to this whole process of building trust, doesn't it? And I think that, and also, I mean, I can say from our particular studio's point of view, is being a studio that's not looking to impose their own footprint on something necessarily all the time, and respecting what had gone before. And I think there could have been other relationships that Janet just would have just not felt trusting in.
Oh yes.
So that took a lot of hard work, and it took lots of meetings, and then, you know, really kind of fun conversations about the park, but also about life and landscape architecture in general, which was really fascinating for me. And then you had some guest visits and bits of advice along the line as well. I think very early doors, before Drew Benlick went to the lottery, when he was still at English Heritage, he came to visit the site. Well,
I only realized that the other day, because what I had forgotten was that I actually wrote a diary, and you know, right at the beginning, before we actually got the bid, you know, and hoping that we would, and it said in it, Drew Benelick came from English Heritage. We walked around the park with a few other people, and then I put, I think he liked it, you know. So that was very early days. And then of course with the Heritage Lottery Fund, I guess for them it was a leap of faith as well, you know, because it wasn't the sort of grand parks that they used, Chiswick House and things like that.
Yeah.
And Wesley Kerr was the chair of the London team, I think.
Yeah.
And so he was really helpful and, you know, positive about it all. So all in all, you know, we just ploughed on. It took a lot of work.
Yes, of course, a lot of work. I remember looking at the spreadsheet that sort of added up all of the volunteer hours as part of the lottery bid. There was quite a lot of volunteer hours.
I think in the end they said to us, you don't have to do any more this month.
Yeah,
you know? Yeah. Sue Morgan was great.
Yeah, she was very good. And you sort of said that really over the years, things haven't, there's been ups and downs, but things don't really change in terms of the way that people use the park. But
no,
I think what's really struck me in various conversations and when I've gone back to visit site and visit you there is, and this is a challenge for lots of public parks now, is the aftercare and having the right people and the right skills involved. And they're lucky that they have you as an unpaid supervisor.
Say that.
But really, I think, I mean, you've even seen since we finished the project, the different people involved makes a huge difference.
It's great. We had a head gardener, okay, and then we had another head gardener, and then we had a gardener who was absolutely great, who gave it up and went over to Camden because his contract wasn't good enough. At which point I wrote a few letters because I just thought that is terrible. You know, there he is now. He's emptying the bins and he's a caretaker and everything, which is great. But you know, he was a good gardener and he swapped over. So finally, things kind of filtered through, and now we have ID Verdi have given us a head gardener, and this head gardener actually fought for this position, and which is good again.
Yeah.
And we also have he's part-time, and we have a full-time gardener, and he originally was working for an agency, but ID Verdi and Camden have made him permanent. So it's great because if you don't get the continuity, it's very, very difficult, especially with our park, because it's wild, you know, it's semi-wild. You can't just slice the bushes. It's not easy. And so we need someone who sees it from season to season, which is what we've got now. So fingers crossed that it continues like that.
And it's funny you should talk about this slicing the bushes, because I heard lots of horror stories about how certain things had happened before over the years. And I remember when I first visited, there was this very telltale sign that so many of the bushes and the shrubs were all trimmed to probably what was the arm's reach of a gardener, or with a piece of mechanical cutting tool.
And then they had a piece on top as well sometimes, with the bit that they couldn't reach kind of spread out.
So that's like,
well, I mean, we do have to, it's difficult to keep the park looking like it is because it is so wild. You know, it's a real balance. But I think our head gardener and the gardener got it. That's great.
And so in terms of where we are with time, is there anything else you'd like to just mention? Or otherwise, I'll hand back to Annabelle and to Helen in terms of maybe questions that people who have listened in might want to ask.
Oh, I don't know, because I could go on forever, so I better just shut up.
Well, maybe they'll come up. Maybe something will come up in the questions that Elizabeth can respond to. So over to you, Helen.
Well, thank you both, Elizabeth and Neil. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. It's been a real treat. It's a bit like eating too much chocolate in one go. You've answered a huge number of my questions, but I will start on the questions if I may. I think this is probably, it's from Karen Fitzsimon, who's probably had to leave by now. Karen, if you are there, do unmask yourself, but otherwise I'll read your question. She says she's seen some of Janet Jack's drawings at the Garden Museum and noticed the BDP on the title block. Had she actually joined BDP at that stage, or was she in sole practice for part of the project?
So as far as I remember, a bit of both, actually. So as many of you may know, Janet's husband, Bill, was the chief executive of BDP, and Janet was set up the landscape unit. So you will find it in the drawings. There are some that have Janet Jack landscape architecture on the title block, and others that have BDP. And I think that's partly due to the sort of the long design process that, you know, it was, well, the whole estate was incredibly long, 69 to 79, 10 years in the sort of making and doing. But then Janet's involvement before it was finished was at least 4 or 5 years. So I think there's somewhere in there she probably moved between.
Yeah, and I have to tell you about those drawings because she had them all rolled up at home. And then one day she said to me, she's going to get rid of them, you know, throw them out. And this is long before the HLF bit. And I said, no, Janet, you can't do that. You just can't, you know. So she said, well, you can have them if you want. So I said, yeah, I'll have them. I'll keep them, you know. So I took them back, put them in my room. There they stayed for, I don't know, X amount of years. And then one day she said to me, Elizabeth, have you still got my drawings? And I said, of course I have. And she said, can I have them back? And I said, yes, I've been waiting for you to ask for them back, you know. And she said, Bill will make you an exact copy of them, you know. Yeah. So great. So that's what we did. I took the drawings back, thank goodness. And I got a copy, which I still got at home. Yeah. But I, you know, when she said to me, I'm clearing up, I've got to get rid of them, I thought, so there we are.
Yeah.
Well done, Elizabeth, and thank goodness you did. Jane asks, how have the residents reacted to the restoration stroke revamp? I'm sure that's one for you, Elizabeth.
They love it. But as Neil said, I mean, when I looked at those photos, I'd forgotten what it would look like, you know, when it was really let go. I mean, and, you know, the concrete blocks and the play equipment, I came home from work once and they were just in the road. They'd all been torn out with the sort of health and safety criteria. And I could have wept. They were all in the road. The concrete blocks I used to love, you know. And so when the park was restored, everybody loved it. But I still get occasional person coming up and saying, I don't know why you did that to the park. I loved it while it, you know, when it was really wild. So, yeah. But all in all, of course, we're really very happy with things, very happy.
And it's interesting how I think Neave wrote somewhere that he always intended the park to be a public park, not just for the residents.
Well, of course it is. And that's another thing. It's not a park that we can cordon off or shut at night or anything. So everybody comes in there. And I mean, in the lockdown, we had loads of people coming and playing golf and all sorts of different things, you know. And of course, people come in there at night for not such good reasons as well, you know. But it's open, it's 24 hours, it's a public park.
That was one of the questions that both Annabelle and I had. Who are the main users? Is it a cut through in Camden? Is it a well-known park? I've seen on the website it's there on Camden's list of parks to visit.
Yes.
Or is it mainly residents?
It's both.
And do you fight? Do you fisticuffs, you know, over who gets to sit?
No, not us personally. No, it's everybody now. Yes, it's a cut through because you can walk through. We obviously I think all the residents use it. I think there might be a few residents who still don't know that it exists. That's one of those things. But recently there's been a survey done of children's play areas, and our park, I've been told, I was sent it, I don't have it now, our park came out pretty well. And so we have lots of mums and dads coming in with small children looking for the blue playground. Yeah, you know, I can, because I can overlook the entrance. My flat overlooks the entrance, so I often see them. And if they're there when I go down, I always direct them. And they've come in on the strength of the survey. So we have that. And there's another thing that's happened recently. Can't remember what it is, but it's brought more people in. And then of course the pandemic though brought people in from all around. Because it was hot and it's shady as well, you know, and it's cool, it's lovely.
And there are some quite unusual users who is very popular with parkour.
Oh yeah,
And
parkour, yeah.
and that's kind of interesting. And so through the design process, we engaged with local parkour groups, because those post and rail barriers that you saw, they love them as balancing beams. Of course, they're not necessarily designed as to take those sorts of loadings, but it's one of those places where that diversity of use is embraced by most people who live there, as Elizabeth says, and I think that's what makes it quite special.
Although we get a lot of complaints about parkour.
Yeah.
Because
is that complaints from residents or complaints from other external
from residents, yeah, from specific residents,
yeah,
because
yeah,
of course
yeah.
they do break the post and rail, you know, but you know, it's all go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A question here from some of Karen Fitzsimon's students, I think. She said, hi, I hope I've said she correctly and it's not he. So we, a few students of Bartlett Landscape, visited the park yesterday as part of our course module with Karen Fitzsimon. And it's lovely to see the transition from what it was in the past, what it looked like when it was restored, and how it looks today. Thank you for the talk today. Did clear up quite a few questions we had yesterday.
Oh, good. So glad, yeah.
And here's another interesting comment from Andrea. The park was wonderful during lockdown. People used it to exercise, to have picnics, small parties, rule of six, walk dogs, play, read, sunbathe, parkour, football, tennis. Lots of people from off the estate come to use it.
Yes.
That's a brilliant comment.
And golf.
And golf, yes. And probably one or two other things that we shouldn't be mentioning.
She's right.
A question for myself, if I may. You mentioned that you had a head gardener and then you had another head gardener. Who is actually employing the head gardeners and who pays for them?
The council. So the council, and it's paid out of Camden's funds. So we pay for it. Parks. I'm never quite sure of how it's divided, but anyway, it's ID Verdi, so they have the contract. Camden have the contract with ID Verdi. So the gardeners at the moment are employed by ID Verdi. I know that for sure.
And is the budget that Camden commits to it sufficient for what needs to be done? I know Neil spoke about phased management tasks. It seems to be.
I don't really know absolute details of, you know, the finances of it, but it does seem to be okay.
It'll be one of those where the proof in the pudding will be in the next couple of years, because we're coming out of our sort of 5 years post construction phase, and where those continued commitments need to be remade by Camden, really. So it's I think that'll be that would be
to keep our eye on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question. Hi, Neil. Thank you for the presentation. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Is it lawn to the playground mound? How does it look now? Is there any maintenance issue? Does the grass still grow? Thank you for that question.
So we had a huge amount of discussion around this before it was lawn. It is lawn. It has a rubber matting over the top of it to help protect it. I think recently it was looking quite healthy, but of course with intense use, and as I said, those swings are very well used, it does get a little bit worn. But again, it's one of those things where it just adds a slightly different materiality and tactile feel to that space. And I think it's probably the right thing, to be honest, in that location. But we talked about it a lot.
Well, that's interesting, because only the other day I walked past we call it the swing park, and I thought, gosh, that grass looks fantastic. And it kind of, you know, like it's been a bit, you know, mowed down and everything, but at the moment it's amazing. It's just green grass. Yeah. So so that's 5 years, isn't it? Or it's taken 5 years for it to grow up like that. I think it's the rain and the sun that we've had.
I was just going to say.
Over the summer. Yeah.
It's nothing to do with your skills, either of you. It's purely the rain. There's a follow-up question as well. Who is the play equipment supplier or manufacturer, please? Thank you.
So it's all bespoke, everything that went in. So that's thanks to Erect Architecture's wonderful skills in designing playgrounds. And the installer was a company called Duncan and Groves. And they've worked a lot with Erect Architecture. This was a testing project for them because this was the first time they'd worked in metal. In a lot of cases, they were very experienced in working with timber playgrounds, but you may well know some of their other works, again, also Erect Architecture. So the Tumbling Bay Playground in the Olympic Park is another of their collaborations. But it's one of those things where, because it's bespoke, it can be challenging in terms of construction. So we work very closely with ROSPA to get all of the relative approvals in place. And as we were talking the other day, it gets some really welcome abuse, I would say, in terms of use, and it, generally speaking, has stood up to that. And where there's been any issues, it's been quickly repaired, which is key. I think that's the really important thing.
So there is a system to bring Ivy straight back in to sort that sort of thing out, is there?
Well, the head gardener checks the playgrounds. I think he does it every week. And for example, there's a little bit, there's a piece of wood that's been broken off in the baby's one at the moment, and it's red taped up, but that will be mended. And it seems to be, things are being mended fairly quickly at the moment, which is great.
There's another comment from Andrea. Andrea, I presume you live on the estate. Would you, if you want to, would you like to unmute yourself and make your own comment? Don't worry if you prefer not to, but if you are willing to speak up.
Hi.
Oh, great, that's fantastic. Would you like to say what you've put in the chat?
Yeah, I do live here. Obviously not as long as Elizabeth. I'm a newcomer, only been here for 30 years. So I just wanted to say that something that's often overlooked is the benefit that we all get from being able to get glimpses of the park from our flats. So from my flats, unlike Elizabeth's, I don't directly overlook the park, but still I can see the tops of the trees from mine, and the way that that connects you with nature when you're at home is really great. And we also get the whole bonus of the wildlife in the park as well, you know, from the birds, the squirrels, the foxes. So yeah, it's really fantastic, and we're just so grateful for the work that Elizabeth and Sarah and Eleanor did to get the park restored.
That's brilliant, thank you. And I probably got time for two more questions. While you're both there, Andrea and Elizabeth, have you both made friends through using the park? This is a question from Annabelle. What has, you've mentioned the things it's added to the quality of life. Do you know people better through having this open space available to you?
I think so, yes. Don't you, Andrea? Yeah,
Definitely.
You're always, if you walk through the park, 9 times out of 10 you bump into someone that you know. So yeah, and of course, in the lockdown we walked around the park and walked around the park. Yeah, and
we cleaned the park.
What?
We did litter picking. We went out with neighbours, so we met people.
Yes, we did. We have a WhatsApp group like everyone, and we did litter picking in the park and everything. Yeah, so yeah, that's very true. We have met people with the park connection. Yeah,
brilliant. Thank you very much. There's probably one last question from Virginia. How far could the design of the estate and its integral landscape, especially its public aspect, be a model for future new housing or commercial development?
Well, I don't know why it isn't, but I never see anything. Maybe I just looking in the wrong place. But every time they have a new, like for example, there's that O2, centre is all going to be on Finchley Road, a massive site. And I looked at it the other day and I thought, where's the low-rise, high-density housing? So I don't know. The answer to that is I don't really know. You probably answer that more.
I think it's, again, going back to one of Neave's comments, and when he was coming up with the concept for this site, he said he deliberately was reacting to a lot of the post-war housing typologies, which were big blocks, tower blocks, sitting in landscape, sort of Le Corbusier style, where the landscape was just leftover bits. So Alexandra Road Estate, Innsmouth Estate, was a deliberate attempt to really integrate everything. I think there are, I mean, it's a really interesting point, is we seem to be going through a moment in London where the solution seems to be always as tall as you can.
Yeah, yeah.
And I do worry about what that means in terms of the public spaces at the foot of these very large buildings that create these unusual microclimates.
What public spaces?
Yeah, well,
walking
exactly.
through London to me is just walking through a series of canyons, as far as I can see.
Yeah.
Virginia, would you like to unmute and just comment on that comment?
Yeah, well, I worked on a lot of GLC overspill in the early 70s. And my goodness, I think, you know, if we'd built like this, it would have been so much better. I don't think there was nothing new in what the GLC was pretty much was building in the 70s. I just think this has got such potential for an instant built-in community. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I've seen it in Denmark, I've seen it in Scandinavia, but not really over here. Doesn't seem to be in our new towns anyway either.
Or in our, no, I know, it's very odd. I don't really know why. You know, in that, you know, the Finchley Road site that I was looking at and the other day, and it's all blocks.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the landscape and the blocks don't have a lot to do with each other.
No, and bits of landscape, yeah.
Yeah, no, I love the public aspect, the fact that, you know, people like me can walk through it, even though I don't live there.
Yeah.
And I don't feel I'm intruding, you know, when I'm walking through. No, I think it's terrific. Lucky old you to live there.
Thanks, Virginia.
Thanks.
I think we're probably running out of time now. Annabelle, are you with us?
Yep.
Can I pass back to you? That's just brilliant. But over to you, Annabelle.
Indeed, yes, thank you. Well, wow, I think that was just amazing insight that you gave us into the restoration, reinvigoration of the park. So thank you very much, Neil and Elizabeth. I think people are vital. I mean, and it is people, not organizations or anything that make a difference. And I think, Elizabeth, what you did was just with your two mates, little trio of you, was just fantastic. And I think what you personally did in saving those drawings, you get the Fowler Award for the
forgotten all about that till I saw them.
Best person of the year, I think. So I think that's just staggering. I think lovely, wonderful job to have worked on and together, and all the friendships and the contacts and things that you've made.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant job to work on. Yeah.